morning. I will read to you now from No Man Shall Profit from Another Man's Labor. It can be found at www.gicjournal.wordpress.com. And a precursor, a note from a friend. Doug, this is to let you know that your essay will be used at the University of Florida in a class, Race, Religion, and Rebellion, by my friend Zahora Simmons, a religion professor and Sufi. That comes from Gwen Fortune, education doctor. The concept of rugged individualism is an American thing, starting with the Puritans, who preached cleanliness is next to godliness, and coming through the Great Depression, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked that Americans pull themselves up by their bootstraps. The combination of Christianity and diligence has been one of the guiding forces that made the United States of America the great country it once was. But a wider reading of the Bible, narrow readings range from Jehovah's Witness to Church of Christ to Seventh-day Adventist, and the Seventh-day Adventists now control 30% of the food supply here in South Korea. We'll get at that later. Are also lumped under the title fundamentalist Christian. Like the one the Quakers adhere to, and most Presbyterians and quite a few Methodists, runs counter to the popular yet ill-informed teaching of most Baptist churches, especially in the South of the United States. George W. Bush, raised a Methodist, had to switch affiliations to Baptist when the Methodist Church of the United States came out against his Iraq war called Shock and Awe. He was notably the only U.S. citizen to be president to switch religions in the middle of his term. How does this apply to the rise of Christianity, mainly in the cities of South Korea? And how can we learn from the title of this article how the Christian church, ostensibly an offshoot of the teachings of Jesus himself, has been warped in many cases to the point where the guiding principles, including the Ten Commandments, of the church have been ignored, and tolerance of, especially greed, has been whisked under the altar carpet, with all sins absolved by the stroke of a Sunday prayer. The 7 deadly sins are wrath, greed, sloth, pride, lust, envy, and gluttony. Religion should be graded based on how well their followers follow their Bibles, or Qurans, or Bhagavad Gitas, or the Old Testament. Since World War II, the United States Christian political leaders have been miserable at following their own book. Often led astray by fundamentalists who promise to round up many votes in trade for an increasingly religious government. One Jefferson warned about when he inscribed the principle of separation in church and state. The Sermon on the Mount, as written by Matthew, says that Jesus condemns the good works of fasting, alms, and prayer when they are only done for show and not from the heart. Love thy enemy as thou love thyself is in there, and the golden rule, treat others as you would have others treat you, is in there. And when slapped, turn the other cheek, meaning offer your aggressor another slap, as perhaps you deserve it. But in no case should you raise a hand to hurt anyone else. This is a condemnation of war, is it not? So if a Christian leads his country into war, or is greedy, or commits adultery, and then shows up at church to get these absolved, that in itself is condemned by Jesus. The Quakers are certainly the most peace-loving Christians, although I'd like to give credit to many Catholic leaders who have often stood up against war and done jail time to fight against the powers of war. And as the Prince of Peace, Jesus condemned war, and though the Bible says war many times is inevitable, it never condones war, and Jesus sure didn't. Then what are Americans and Koreans to think of the inexcusable, unnecessary, and horrific wars the United States has been involved in since 1960? The only president who resisted these wars of greed was a Catholic, John F. Kennedy, and it is no coincidence that he was assassinated because he was against fighting a major war in Vietnam. Kennedy was the only Catholic ever elected president, and it is also interesting to note the huge majority of U.S. presidents who go to church, but who are also Freemasons. Starting with George Washington himself, this band of earth-controlling gentlemen have wielded great power and been inadequate Christians, especially when held to the standard Christ himself ascribed. Christ was a left-wing radical, a man who suggested rich people give to charity, greed is a sin, and that in fact no man should profit from another man's labor. This makes him in today's world a socialist. He was also an environmentalist, and were he alive today might be requesting people to stop driving cars for the sake of future generations. Thus, any church that flies conservative values in the name of Christ should break away from Christianity and form their own religion. In this case, I speak directly to the Mormons, who also bother people on the streets here in South Korea, trying to prove to them that somehow their relatives were Mormons back in the day of Joseph Smith. This we doubt, but the Mormons hook people by telling them that Jesus walked in the United States. And of course, if you will believe that one, then you will believe anything. And once they know that you'll believe anything, you are completely hooked into this church, which, by Christian standards, must be considered a cult. Whether they call themselves Latter-day Saints or not, it doesn't matter. To preach things so false and so inconceivable, and then to have people commit their lives and 2 years of missionary work and a lot of their money, and in trade for which they'll be given a good job, because conservatives tend to control a lot of the big corporations, and some of them are Mormons. This is not a church. This is a business setup. And we'll see how the church becomes a business setup in Korea as well, and the Korean churches in the United States in particular. The only hint of a conservative value coming from the Bible comes from the Old Testament's 10 Commandments, thus predates Christ. Number 5, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Fits nicely into the Confucian principles Korea has followed since, and I quote, the 1st century after the Chosun dynasty was founded, when the volume of legislation that was concerned with social issues was unusually high. This comes from the Confucian Transformation of Korea by Martina Duchler, page 3. This means that Confucian principles were being made into law. It is this long-held tie to Confucianism that made it easy for fundamentalist Christians to get a foothold in Korea. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in particular has found its way to control, some people estimate, 30% of the Korean food supply. Only about 2% of the Asian population is Christian. And while Christians are to be found in virtually every Asian country, it is South Korea that has witnessed the most spectacular and historically significant Christian expansion. Many of these churches are mom and pop churches on the corner, just like a convenience store, that are built for the sole purpose of making mom and pop some extra won or their entire income. You have to come here to believe how many Christian churches are set up strictly as a money-making scheme for families. It's disheartening, to say the least. In the past 3 decades, in the period of this country's remarkable modernization, it has also stepped away from Buddhism and into a type of Christianity. Even the Presbyterian Church, which was the first American church to have a female minister, as I recall, Rochester, New York, as I recall, even the Presbyterian Church here is extremely conservative, which does not jibe at all with the Presbyterian Church in Germany or the United States or anywhere else that I know of. Because conservative values run throughout Confucian and fundamentalist teachings, it has been relatively easy for fundamentalist churches and others to synergize the two beliefs and gain great strength in South Korea. But Jesus was not conservative.